Okay guys, so welcome to video number 3 of this series. In this one, what we're gonna do is work on this add to cart functionality right here, and also work on updating the cart from our cart page. So we're gonna be able to change the quantity, remove items, and handle all sorts of things like that. So we'll finish that up, and then we will also work on our checkout page. So we're gonna add some logic to this page and output forms depending on who's logged in and the items that are in their cart. So they'll be able to check out their order without a payment for now. We're going to handle that in a later module, but that's what we're going to take care of in this one. And we are working right here with site functionality, and these are the parts that we're going to go through today. So this is where we're going to start adding some JavaScript into our website here. So if we go to part 1, the first thing we need to do is create this cart.js file, and then we want to add some event handlers that listen to whenever this button is clicked, and for now just console out some data into our console, and then we'll start working from that. So we'll open up our app here and we'll go to static, and we'll create a new folder called JS, and this is where we'll add in any JavaScript that we're going to create. And within JS, we're going to create a file called cart.js. So this file right now, what we're going to do is first just console out just something into the browser so we can see it. So we're just going to say hello world, and what we're going to have to do is add in this file somewhere into our template. So what we'll do is add it into our main template, and we're going to add it just underneath our bootstrap JavaScript. So we want this on the bottom of the page so the page can first load, and then we can execute anything within this cart.js file. So let's go ahead and add that. We'll go to our page here and close that out. So we have our console, it's consoling out hello world, and we need to go ahead and open up main.html. So we'll open this up, and just underneath the 3 bootstrap JavaScript files there, let's go ahead and write script. And for the source, this is going to be similar to how we added images and CSS links. So we're going to say static, and in quotes, we're going to say js/cart.js. So that's just going to look for our static folder for the JS file, and then open up cart.js. So now that this is in main.html, we should see this console out in all of the pages that inherit from it, which are all of the pages on our website right now. So we'll open up inspect element here, open up the console, make sure that it's all linked up. So we're seeing that within our homepage, our cart, and checkout. So everything's looking good. What we want to do now is add in some event handlers to these buttons. So whenever we click these, we want to console something out, and there's a few things that we want to take care of here. So the first thing is we need a class that can identify a certain button that's clicked, and we're going to use the class of updateCart because we want to keep this consistent with our homepage and our checkout page. So these images right here will also have the class of updateCart, and so will all the buttons. So once we add the class, what we want to do is add in some custom attributes. So I'll zoom in here. Within HTML, we can create a custom attribute by setting data dash and then our attribute name, and we pass in the value. So we want to get the product ID, and we also want to get the action. So we're going to have 2 actions. For now, we're just going to add, or we're going to use add, and then eventually we're going to bring in the action of remove for our checkout page. So essentially, we want to know which button was clicked, what the product ID was, and what do we need to do for this product. So do we want to add it or remove it? So I'm going to go ahead and start there. We'll go to store.html, and we're going to add the class of update-cart. So remember, we want to add this class so we can later use JavaScript to set event handlers on this button. So once we have that, we can create custom attributes in HTML by setting data dash and then wherever we want our attribute name to be. So the first one is going to be product, and we're going to set the value of product to the product ID. So we'll just pass in product.id, and then we want to set the action. So data dash action, and we want to set this value for now to add. So whenever this button is clicked, we want to add an item to our cart. So let's go ahead and save that, and we can remove this console We'll also save that, and let's go to the next step. So in the next step, what we just did here is we added this class right here of update cart, and we want to use that to create an event handler for each button. So we're first going to query all of the cart items by that class that we just added, and then we're going to create a loop. We're going to loop through all of our buttons, and we're going to add an event listener on click, and we're first going to get the product ID that we just set, the action, which this is how we can query those custom attributes, and then we're going to console them out and make sure that we have the correct product ID and the correct action. So let's go ahead and add that. So this will all be added in cart.js, and remember, we're in main.html, so that's how these two files are connecting, because this is just inheriting from that. So I'll move this to the right, and we're first going to set the variable of update buttons to that query set of our buttons. So var update buttons, or BTNs, and we want to camel case that, and we're going to set that to document.get elements by class name. And we're going to use this class right here. So let's just grab that and paste that in. So we first get all of our buttons, and we now want to create a loop. So what I'm going to do is zoom in so we can see this a little bit better, and I'll just move our HTML file to the right. So here's our buttons, and we want to create that for loop. So we're going to say for, and first set the actual loop. We're going to say var I, and I is going to equal to 0. So this is going to be, we're going to be looping through this query set. So we want to set the index to 0. And then we want to say while I is less than update buttons dot length. So as we're iterating through it, we want to know where we're at in this loop right here. And then we want to increment I. So we're going to do I plus plus. So for those of you new to JavaScript, this is how we create the loop. So we loop through our buttons length here, and on each iteration, what we want to do is get the query set, and then we want to index that query set with I. So on each iteration, it's going to increment. So we pass in I right here. And for each button, we're going to add event listener. So we add the event listener, and the type of event we want to listen for is click. So we're going to add in click, and then on click, what do we want to do? So we want to set a function, and this function is going to execute on each click. So the first thing we want to do is set the product ID, and we want to console this out. So we're going to say var product ID. So we're going to set ID, or I, to capital here, and we can get that custom attribute we set here. So product ID and action, or product and action here, we can get that by saying data set, or this. So this is actually similar to Python's self method. So we're just saying the item that's clicked on, that's what this is going to represent. We're going to say this dot data set dot product, and I think we just called it product. I always forget as I'm typing here. So this dot product. So we're going to set that, and then we're going to get the action. So var action is going to be equal to this dot data set dot action. So we get both values, and now we just want to console them out and make sure that our event handler was added and we are getting the values as we click on them. So move that to the right. The first thing we'll console out is going to be the product ID, and we're going to go ahead and add that, and then we're going to get the action. So we'll throw in the name there, and then throw the actual value. So now when we go to our template, when we refresh this, let's open up our console here. We should see the action and the product ID on click. So let's start by clicking the first product here. So we'll click on headphones. We get the ID of 1 and the action of add. If we go to this last one, we're going to get the product ID of 6, and so on. So this just added an event handler to each button, and we are getting the values. So now we want to do something with these values, but before we do that, we need to change the behavior of what happens depending on the user that's logged in. So the first thing we're going to do, if we go to step 3, we want to first set the user in our main.html, and we want to know, is this an anonymous user or is this authenticated user? So we're going to set the variable of user to request.user. And then depending on what that user value is, down in our event handler, we're going to create this if statement. So I just want to console out the user to ensure what that value is. And then we're going to say if the user is anonymous user, go ahead and console out this user is not authenticated. And then if that user is, go ahead and console out user is authenticated, sending data. So once we add in that event handler, that's where we'll actually take care of creating a view to send that data to, and we'll process that. So let's go to our main.html file. So I'm actually going to close out store. We're going to move cart.js to the right. And I'm going to put this in main.html because I want the user to be available at the top of every page and as soon as we load the page. So we're just going to create this script tag within our head tag in main.html, and we'll set the user. And we're going to set var user. That's going to be equal to request.user. And we're going to close this up in single quotes. So now that we have our user, let's go to cart.js and write that conditional. So the first thing is let's console that user. So console.log, and we'll say user, throw in this variable. Again, it's available because we are inheriting from main.html. So let's ensure that that's working, and let's give this a test. So inspect. So on each click, if we refresh this, let's go ahead and add to cart. So we have our product ID in action, and we are now working with the user. So if we log out, it's going to say anonymous user. So let's go ahead and write that logic. So we're going to say if, and write in the conditional. So if user is equal to anonymous user, so I think we have to set the capitalization exactly as Django renders it. So capital A, anonymous, and then capital U, so anonymous user. We'll go ahead and console.log, and we'll just say not logged in. And if the user is logged in, so if we're not an anonymous user, we'll just say else, and we'll just console out user is logged in, sending data. Okay, so let's go ahead and give that a test now. So we have the user, we can refresh this, and we'll just hit add to cart. User is logged in, sending data, and let's go to the admin panel and log out. So we just want to make sure both sides are working. So now if we refresh that, user is an anonymous user, and we're consoling out not logged in on each button click. So the next thing is we want to, first let's log back in so we have everything ready. Let's go ahead and create our view and URL path to actually send this data. So if I go to my steps here, we'll scroll down to step 4. So what we need to do is create a view called updateItem, and we're just going to return a JSON response for now. And we also want to set a URL path. So we're going to create a path, and then we're going to send data to this view. So let's open up our views.py file within our app here. And we first want to import JSON response to use for our view. So we're going to say from Django.http import JSON, capital J, and then capital R response. So we don't want to return a template or anything like that. We just want to return some kind of message. So that's why we're using JSON response. And we want to create our view. So we'll call that update item. And we're going to pass in request. And this is where we're going to use that response. So we're going to say return. We'll use JSON response. And we're going to say item was added. And we also want to return this as, we want to return safe as false. So we just want to get this message in our template if we ever want to confirm anything. So that's why we're returning that response here. And now we need to set our URL path. So we'll close out cart.js and we'll create a pattern for this. So we're just going to add that again under checkout. We're going to repeat what we're doing in our views. So we'll just copy and paste this, and we'll pass in update item. And for the actual pattern, we're going to say update underscore item and repeat that for the name. So let's make sure that this view is working. So we'll go to our page here and pass in update item. And that is our JSON response. So we want to return that to the template whenever we make the API call. So let's go to the next step here. And after we create that, what we want to do is create a function in our in that event handler that we had. And instead of returning user is authenticated right in that else statement, we're going to create a function called update user order. To that function, we're going to pass in the product ID. Let's zoom in just to make sure everyone can see this. We're going to pass in the product ID and the action to the function. Once we pass that in, we'll be able to actually create a fetch call. So we're going to make a post request and we're going to send this data to that new view we just created. So we're going to send to updateItem. We're going to send product ID and action to the backend to our view that we just created. And then our view will be in charge of processing that. So let's go ahead and start creating that update order function. So we have the URL, we have our view. So I'm actually going to move the view to the right and we'll open up cart.js again. So in here, what we want to do is set the function to update user order. And we'll create user, we'll make that capitalized for the U, and then order will also be capitalized. And we're going to pass in product ID and action. Once we have the function, what we want to do is pass in this logic, and we'll throw that into the function so it gets called from here. And then we'll trigger this function inside of this else statement. And this is where we can pass in the product ID and action that we set. So we pass it in, and then we can call it right here. So to send this data, we're going to use the fetch API. And before we do that, we're going to set the URL that we want to send the post data to. And we're going to call this update_item. So this is that URL and view that we just created. So we're saying this is where we want to send the data to. And I'm going to try to go over fetch as slow as possible for people that might be new to this. So to send our post data, we're going to use fetch. And the first thing we need to pass into fetch is the URL that we want to send the data to. And then we want to define what kind of data we're going to send to the backend here. So the first thing is we want to know the type that we're going to send. So we're going to send post data. And once we're sending post data, we need to pass in some headers with that. And the headers are just going to be an object here. And the first thing we're going to throw in is content-type. And T has to be capitalized along with C in content. And this value is going to be application/JSON. So if you're new, I recommend you look up the fetch API, look up how to send post data so you understand this better. But we're just going to throw in the values and I'll do my best to explain. So once we set the method type, the headers, we need to send a body. So the body is going to be the data that we're going to send to the backend. And this data, we want to send it as an object here. So we're going to say, first, we're going to pass in the product ID, and then we're going to throw in the action. So we're going to throw product ID in there, pass in action. And one thing that we need to do with this data with the fetch API is we can't just send the object to the backend. We need to send it as a string. So we're going to grab this data, and then we're going to stringify it. So we're going to do JSON.stringify, and we're going to wrap that entire object. So we have that value and then we can send the data. So this is all we need to send that data. Once we send it, we also want to return a promise. So to return a promise, this is going to be the response that we get after we send the data to this view. So we're going to send the data to the view, and then once that data is processed and everything went right, we want to return this response as a promise to fetch. So let's go ahead and create that. The first thing we need to do is set .then, and we first need to turn this value into JSON data. So we're going to say response, and we're going to use an arrow function here, 2 curly braces, we'll create some space, and we're going to say return response.json. And after that, we're going to copy this again. We'll paste it just below here. And this time we actually want to console that data out. So we'll take out this return value because we have it now. And we're going to say console.log. And we want to console out the data that we got back, which is just going to be this string value right here. So we want to be able to see that. So we'll throw that in. And actually we want to console that out too. So we have our post request. So fetch sets the URL, the type. we pass in the data, we get the response, turn that into JSON value, and then we want to console that out. So one thing that's going to happen right now is whenever we're sending post data to the backend in Django, is we need to send in a CSRF token. And normally this is done through a form. We create that within the form, but because we're using JavaScript, we don't have it. So as we hit add to cart, we're actually going to get an error that I show you here in this description. So we're going to get this error telling us that we can't send this data to the backend. And I'll show it to you real quick, and then we'll actually fix it. So let's go ahead and open up our console before we hit add to cart, and we'll set that. So open up the console. Looks like we have an error on line 30. So it looks like the error is right here. So this needs to be a key value pair. So we need to throw in a colon right here, and the comma needs to be after product ID. So once we save and refresh that, if I refresh it, I think that'll make that go away. So that fixed it. And now when we hit add to cart, we get that error that I was telling you about. So what we need to do now is go ahead and create that CSRF token, and that's going to be in the next step. So step 6, we're going to create that token, and Django actually has in the documentation a way for us to do this within JavaScript. So I'll open up this documentation here. You can just look up Django CSRF token Ajax, and essentially what we're doing here, I'll zoom in here, is we're creating a token with this function. So we're getting the cookies here, and we're setting the value of this variable CSRF token to get cookie, and we're finding the token that we're creating. So let's actually just grab all of this, and we'll paste that into our headers. So we're going to throw that into our main.html file, and that's going to be within the script tag that we created, and we're going to set that after our user variable. So we'll paste that in. I'll fix the indentation here, but once we create this token is now going to be available down in our fetch call. So it's in the same template, which means we have access to the CSRF token, and we can set the token, if we look at the documentation, just by adding it into our headers. So x-CSRF token, we'll pass that in, and then we just want to reload the page once we throw that in. So we'll take that, we'll add a comma right there, and we'll say x-CSRF T, that's all capitalized. Then we'll finish off the word token, and that actually needs to be a string. So we'll throw that in, and then as the value, we're going to paste in this token. So let's copy that, and we'll paste it in right here. So now that we're throwing in the token, we are going to send this data to the backend. So that error should go away, and then we'll handle actually processing that data and adding these items. So now that I send it, we get back that response. So we're consoling out data right there. So that's that promise that we returned. So if you're seeing this, we're consoling out data, which is what our view is sending back to the template. So we're sending back that response from our view right here. So we're getting item was added, and then we're consoling that out. So before we get into the view logic, I actually want to rename the cookie here, or the function, from get cookie to get token. And I want to do this because I actually want to use that same name when we're creating the cookie for our guest users. So it just seems like it makes more sense to call it that. So we're going to change the function here and here. So once we have that, that shouldn't change any values, just the function name. And let's go ahead and get into the actual logic of the backend. So we send the data, and in the backend, what we want to do first is just print out this data. So we want to get the data. We're going to use this import of JSON. We're going to parse that data because right now we're sending it in as a string value. We're going to parse it, and we're going to parse request.body, which is what we're sending in. And then we're going to get some values. So we're going to get the product ID, the action, and I want to print it first. And this is what we should see in our console. So once that's printing correctly, we'll move on to actually creating a customer or querying that customer. And then we're going to get the product that we're passing in, and we are either going to create or add to the order. So let's go ahead and take care of that. And we can go to our views. So I can close main.html. We'll open up our views on the left side here. And let's first run an import and get that JSON function here. So we'll import JSON, and it's different from JSON response. So we're just going to import that. And the first thing we want to do is set the value of data to that response. So we're going to say JSON.loads, and this is going to be request.data. So we're passing in that data and we want to print it out now. So that's the post request we're sending. And then we're going to say product ID. And this is going to be set to data, and we can access it now because it's now a dictionary once we parse that. And we're going to get that product ID that we sent in from cart.js. So we sent in this data right here, and we need to just query that. So we're going to get that product ID, if I can copy that correctly, and we're going to pass that in right here. So we're going to query data and grab that value. And then we want to do the same for action. So we're going to say action, then we're going to get action out of that value, and let's go ahead and print out action and product ID. So we'll set action here as a string value, throw in the actual value, and let's print out product ID. And before we test that, I realized that we accidentally threw that colon in with the string, so we need one outside of it, but not within the action string. So, and I'll just move that here. Let's go ahead and test that. Let's open up our command prompt and let's add a few items. So we'll refresh that, make sure it's all working. And when I hit add, we should see the product ID and the action print out. So there we go, we have a product ID. So the next thing we need to do is finish up this logic and actually add some items. So we'll go into this, we'll query the customer and start creating the order. So the first thing I'll do is just underneath this action and product ID is we'll get the customer. So we're going to set customer to request.user.customer. So we're going to get the logged in customer, and then we want to get the product. So product is going to be equal to the product ID. So that's why we needed to pass that in. And that's going to be product.objects.get. And the ID value is going to be the product ID right here. So that's why we passed that in. We can get the product now, and now what we want to do is get or create the order. So I'll actually just copy and paste what we created up here. We're trying to get the same exact thing. So we're trying to get an order attached to that customer that has the value of complete to false. So order is now going to be the return value, and we want to create an order item. So for order item, we're also going to use get or create. So we're going to set order item and then create or created. And for this, the return value is going to be order item dot objects dot get underscore or underscore create. And we're going to set the order value to the order that we just queried right here. And then we're also going to set the product. So the reason why we're using get or create is because we need to change the value of the order if it already exists. So if this order item already exists according to the product and the order, we don't want to create a new one. We simply want to change the quantity of it. So we want to add or subtract. So if we go to our notes here, if we look at this, if the action is add, we want to get the order item quantity and we want to add to it. If it's remove, we'll remove it, and then we'll save that. Once we save it, we'll check if the quantity is 0 or below 0. If it is, we want to remove that item. And we haven't added in that remove in the front end yet, but we'll add it, and then we'll just be able to use this throughout the template. So let's go ahead, or throughout the website. So once we have that, let's go ahead and write that conditional, and we'll say if action is equal to add, let's go ahead and increase the value. So we'll just say order item dot quantity. And then we'll just increase the quantity. So we'll say order item dot quantity, and we're going to add 1 to that. So we'll set the value to +1, and then we're just going to say elif. And I just want to use elif just in case another action gets sent in. We want to be able to read that. So we'll say remove, and then we want to decrease it. So let's grab this same exact value, and this time we want to remove from the quantity. So we'll take that, and then we'll save it. So we're going to say order item dot save, and let's go ahead and remove that order if the quantity is below 0. So if order item dot quantity, is less than or equal to 0, we just want to delete it. So OrderItem.delete. So that should take care of all the logic we need in this page. And remember that we're only going to send data to this view whenever a user is logged in. When a guest user is clicking these buttons, the action is going to change. So let's give this a test. Right now we won't see anything, but we could check our cart and see how it's all working. So we'll add a few items. I clicked it. We're not seeing this cart update here. We'll work on that in the next step. But when we go to our cart, we'll see 7 items. Let's go back. Let's add a watch here. We'll add 2 of them. I clicked on it twice and we should see a watch here. So what we're going to do in the next step is take care of adding this cart total. So what we're going to do is update this, and we're going to have this update on each click. And this is the part where we'll really see the value of using more JavaScript and maybe in the future a REST API. But right now what I'm going to do is get the cart total in the backend with the views and then pass it into each template. So this is where, again, we're going to see the effect of using more JavaScript, and we're going to make things a little bit better. But for now, I actually missed this in the last step. We want to make sure that our page reloads, and then once that new data gets passed in, we'll be able to see it immediately. So let's go ahead and fix this. And to do that, we're just going to, just underneath console, do location.reload. So this is the way we can do this in JavaScript. We're just going to reload the page, and then we're going to pass in the data inside of each view. So this is where I actually really struggled in trying to make our code more efficient without building out a REST API or using more JavaScript. And I actually created a solution last night. I came up with one that I'll probably add in a premium module here. This is just going to be another video that I'll add, and it's probably going to be module 6 or 7. And we're going to enhance how our information gets passed into this cart. But for now, what we have to do is create some user data inside of every single view that has this cart, and we have to pass it in. So I'll show you what I mean by this. And we'll just get started by first getting all of this user information. And again, our code is going to get a little bit redundant, but we are going to fix this. So if you're one of those people that's more advanced, you're probably going to see where our code is starting to become a little bit inefficient, but we will create a solution later. So we'll fix it. But for now, let's just go ahead and create it this way. So what we need to do is create a variable called cart items, and we need to pass in this variable within every single template here. So we need to pass it into the context dictionary. So for now, what we're going to do is set cart items to order.get cart items. And we also need to make sure that this variable is available for a guest user. So we're going to set cart items to this order now, but because it's a dictionary, we're just going to throw in this cart items total. So again, it's not that efficient right now. We'll fix it, but at this point, now that we have cart items, we can pass it into the context dictionary, and we can use it inside of our templates. So we'll first go to our main.html, and we'll pass that in. So we'll set main here, or we'll go to main, and we need to go to that navigation bar. So where we have cart items, because we passed it in right here, we can use it inside here. So let's replace 0, and we'll just set that to cart items. Now, if I go to my homepage, we'll see it, and we should see the total appear within that header bar. Okay, so we have our cart total, and now as we add items, we'll see it update because we are refreshing the page. Again, also not the most efficient way. This is where I would normally create a REST API to take care of this, but the items get updated. The problem here is when we go to cart, we are going to be looking for that cart items variable there, and we're not going to see it. So what that means is we need to set this value for all of the views. So again, it's starting to get a little bit redundant, but I'm trying to show you that manual process so we can eventually fix it, and you'll understand why we're fixing it the way we are. So we'll set that to the logged in user, the guest user, and we need to pass that in. So once we throw that in, we can now refresh our cart page, and we should see the total here. Okay, so now we have the total, and when we go to our checkout page, we also need to add that into this section. So let's set cart items for the guest and cart items for the logged in user. So even before we come up with that solution or add in that solution that I was telling you about, we're going to clean up this code a lot in the next few sections. We're just trying to go over the manual process. So let's throw that into the context dictionary. And now within our checkout page, we have our totals. So our totals are being rendered out in every single page, and they also update automatically as we do this. And within the next step, what we're going to be doing is actually working on that update feature. So we have part 1 in module 3 taken care of, and we now need to add some event handlers to this right here to eventually allow us to decrease the quantity and remove items. So let's go ahead and go to part 2. For updating and removing items in our cart, most of the logic was already done in part 1. So what we want to do now is add the event handlers to these, which we've actually technically already done. So what we need to do is simply add the class of update cart and set some values. So we need to add in the product ID and set some actions. So for this one, for the down arrow, we want to add the action of remove. So this is where we'll actually update it, and we need to add that class. So once we handle this, all of the logic was already done inside of cart.js. So let's open that up. And cart.js, the second we add in update cart and some values to those buttons or to those images, everything should be taken care of. So we'll open up cart.html. Remember, cart.js is in main.html, so we have full access to it, and we want to set these up and down arrows. So for the up arrow, let's just move this to the left here. Let's add the class of update button or update cart, so update-cart, and we want to do the same for the down arrow. So both of them are going to be the same class. The only difference is going to be the attributes that we pass in for the type. So data-product, and we'll throw in the product ID. And in this case, because we're looping through the item, it needs to be item.productID. So we'll set that, and then we'll set the data-action. And for the up arrow, it's going to be add, which we've already done before. And let's just copy and paste this to the down arrow, and we'll change this to remove. So that's going to be the only difference. And when we click that, we're just going to pass in a different action. And in this case, we're just going to remove it, and then the page is going to get reloaded. So we'll see that refresh right away. So let's try that. We'll go to our cart page. And now when we click on this, we should see the quantity update. Looks like the product ID was passed in incorrectly. So let's fix that. So that should be data-product, not equals. And now it should work. So let's refresh that again. And when we hit down, the quantity should change and the cart will get updated. So again, for those beginners that are always asking why we need JavaScript or where it can become effective, this is exactly where. Right now we're reloading the page, which is a completely inefficient way, and JavaScript can completely fix this for us, and we'll do this in module 6 or 7, but this is a perfect example on why this needs to be fixed. Right now our page is really small, so the reload is quick, but once we put this up on a server or have bigger pages, this is going to be super inefficient to have to reload the page each time. So now that we have our cart functionality done, our update cart, let's go ahead and check out our shipping address. So what we're trying to do here is add some logic to our shipping form here to change if the products that we have in our cart don't need shipping. So if there is a single item in our cart that needs shipping, we'll prompt the user for the shipping address, but if it's a digital product, there's no reason we need a shipping address. So let's go ahead and take care of that. And if we go to our website, we go to the checkout page, this is what we're trying to hide. So eventually we'll add in all the digital or one digital product, and we'll remove all of these physical products. So our only digital product is the project source code, and we'll just set up that functionality. So let's go to the steps here. And in step 1, the first thing we want to do is add a shipping method to our order. So our order model, we want to add a shipping method that essentially loops through all of the order items, and if there's a single product in our order that has digital set to false, which means that it's a physical item, let's go ahead and set shipping to true. And that means, yes, there is an item in here that needs to be shipped. And then we're going to add some logic into our page that's going to change that value. So if we render out that shipping field here, so we'll actually query that and then set it to our user that also is not logged in. So we'll set both values. And then after that, we'll add some logic that's going to hide those form fields or display them depending on what the value is. So let's open up our models.py file, and we're going to have to update our order model. So let's go ahead and add shipping between cart total and that string value. And we're going to use a property decorator again. So let's set property and we'll call it shipping. And by default, we're going to set the variable of shipping to false. And then we need to return it. So if we don't do anything, shipping is always going to be false. So now what we want to do is query all of the order items. So we have that here. Instead of typing that out, we'll set that. And now let's loop through all of the order items and check if any of those items have the value of digital set to false. So we'll loop through each item, and then we're going to say if i.product.digital is equal to false, then what we want to do is set shipping to true. So I'll show you what I mean by that when we go to that model. So the value gets set to true, and then if any of those products need to be shipped, now we change the value. So if we go up to our product here, so digital by default is set to false. So that means every item by default is going to be a physical item. And then if it's digital, that changes. So we're saying that if any of those items have digital set to false, they need to be shipped, change the value. So let's go back to our steps here, and we'll go up to, we have our shipping method. Now we can go to order item shipping status. We need to render this out in the template. So by default, in our views, I'll move this to the right because we might need to reference this. In our views, we already pass in the order object, which has this shipping method right here that we can access in the template. We also need to set this for our guest user because we need to manually set that value and make sure that we can access it if the user is not logged in. And then we'll actually update the status in a different way in module 4. So let's set shipping to false by default. And then let's make sure that this is also added in each dictionary here for all 3 views. So we'll pass that in here, and we're going to pass that down here. So eventually these will all be consolidated. So we're only going to do this once, but that sets that value. So we passed it in. And now if we go to step number 3, in our checkout.html page, we want to add some JavaScript at the bottom of the page. We're going to do this inside of our template. And we want to first get the value of shipping. So if we're querying the model, we can do order.shipping, or if we are querying this dictionary in our template, we can still do order.shipping. So that's why we needed to set both values. And then we're going to check if shipping is false. Go ahead and get the inner HTML of that wrapper and remove it. So shipping info, if we check out, let's go ahead and just remove or close out our views. We'll save our models and go to checkout.html. So shipping info is right here. This was that wrapper that we set. So I can shrink that. And now it opens and closes right here. So we're going to take shipping info and hide it. So let's go ahead and just within our HTML here, we're going to write our JavaScript. And the reason why we're doing this in line is because we only need this JavaScript in this page. And we just want to be able to move around back and forth and view our page as we set things. So let's set the variable of shipping. And this value is going to be our order.shipping. So order.shipping. And now we are querying that method that we just created. And shipping is either true or false. So we can write a conditional and we can say if, and we'll just say shipping is equal to false. And false is going to be a string value because we are querying that order.shipping value. Instead of using JavaScript's false value, which is a capital or a lowercase value like that, it's just going to be a string. So we're going to say if shipping is equal to false, then we can get that value or get that ID and remove it. So or change the value inside of it. So let's say document.get element by ID. and we want to get this shipping info ID. So we're going to take that, and then we're going to set the inner HTML. So we're going to say .inner HTML, and that's all capitalized, and we can just set that to an empty string, and that's going to remove anything inside of that wrapper. So if I go to my page here, looks like we messed something up on models.py. So let's fix that really quick. And line 52. So it looks like we created a space between property there. So we'll save that. And again, if shipping is false, let's remove that form field. So let's refresh it. And right now, if we go to our cart, we should see it because we have products that need shipping. So right now, the book, watch, and headphones need shipping. If we go to our cart, we'll add in project source code. So that's the only item in our cart that doesn't need shipping. We'll remove the watch, take out the book here, and once I take everything out, we should see that form be removed. So let's go to checkout, and now it's reading it. It doesn't show it. If we go back to our cart or go back to the store, add a new item that requires shipping, open it up, and there we go. So that's the logic we wanted to add. If we go to the next step here, so we'll go to step 4 right here, payment option. And what we want to do here is hide open up our payment option here whenever our form gets submitted. So we want to hide the button, but we also want to open up the wrapper. Right now, we don't have any credit card fields or anything like that, but we do want to open those up, but also give the user the ability to still edit these form fields. So if I go to my page here, go to checkout, right now, when we submit this, nothing happens, but we do want this button to be hidden and then open up that form wrapper. So let's start with that. And we can go back to step 4 here at the top. What we want to do is add an event handler. So first, we will query the form by the ID, and then we're going to say whenever the form is submitted, so add event listener on submit, go ahead and prevent the form from submitting, and then add the class of hidden to our form button, and then remove the class of hidden from our payment info wrapper. So let's start with that. We'll go to checkout.html and add that in. So first we'll set form, and that's going to be equal to document.getElement by ID, and we simply added the ID of form. If you want to see where that's at the top here. We added that in, and now we can add the event handler. So we'll say form.add event listener, and this time we did click earlier. Now we want to do submit. So on submit, let's create the function. So on submit, this is the function that we're going to trigger, and the first thing we want to do is E. So on event, we're going to pass that into the function. We're going to say prevent default, and D is going to be capitalized. And this is just going to stop the form from performing its normal actions. We're going to prevent anything from happening, and we want to handle the rest. So we first want to console.log, and we just want to say form submitted. And once the form is submitted, let's go ahead and remove and add those classes. So we're going to say document.getElement by ID. So we can just take that right there. And the first one we want to hide is going to be that form button. So remember, on our form field right here, the button has the ID of form button. So we want to take that by ID, we'll pass that in, and now we want to hide it. So to hide that, what we're going to do is .class list, and L is going to be capitalized, and we're going to take this class list and we are going to add. So .add, and we're going to add the class of hidden. So once we do that, we're going to repeat this for our payment wrapper. So we'll copy and paste that, and we need the ID to the payment info wrapper. So payment info right here, and right now it just contains this text with PayPal options, and we need to set this value. And for this, it already has the class of hidden. So if we look at it, it already contains the class of hidden, so it's already out of the picture. In this case, we want to remove instead of add. So for one, we're going to add the class of hidden. For another, we're going to remove it. So let's go ahead and try this and open up our page here, refresh it. And I actually just noticed I spelled default wrong here. So prevent default won't work until we fix that. So make sure there is an L before the T there. So prevent default. Now let's refresh it. And I'm just going to throw in some name here and some filler data. And when I hit continue, now the button is hidden and the payment option wrapper is open. So that's what that just did. We removed one class, we added another. So let's go to the next step here. And what we want to do is throw in just a default button for now that will trigger a payment. So right now we're going to let a user check out without actually paying. That will be added in another module, but we're going to throw in a button here that has the ID of make payment and the text of make payment. So we'll close all these out right now. And this is what the button's going to look like. So once the user adds in this information, they can click make payment and it'll actually process the order. So let's close out the picture here and add that in. So let's go up to our payment wrapper, and underneath PayPal option, we'll create a button. And the ID of the button will be make-payment. And we'll just say make payment here. So once we have that button there, it'll appear once the form data is filled out. So let's just test that. We'll add in some data, submit it, make payment is here. What we want to do next is add in an event handler that will actually send the data. So right now what we're going to do is first create this function called submit form data, and then we're going to trigger it. And for now, all we're going to do is just console out data is submitted. So right now, here's our submit form data function, payment button clicked, that'll trigger. And then in the next part, we'll actually go through that checkout process. So back in our checkout.html page, at the bottom here, let's create that function. So first thing we'll do is just underneath this event handler, create the function called submit form data. So D and F are capitalized there. We're not passing any parameters for now. And let's console.log payment button clicked. So we have the function, and we want to trigger that just after we add the event handler to our payment button. So document.get element by ID. And we're going to get that new button. So that button was called make-payment. And let's add the event handler. So on click, so add event listener, and that's going to be on click here. We're going to trigger that function that we just created. So on click, we're going to put that within a function, and we're going to pass in the event here. We do want to access that later, and we're going to say submit form data. So there we go. So we added the event handler to that make payment button. We set that on click, and we're going to trigger this function. So let's test it really quick one more time. Open up our console so we can see it. So if I refresh it, we'll add in some data here. So we'll throw that in, click that, and then when we submit it, payment button click. So I think it's just showing up funny because it was small there, but now the function's triggering, and we want to, in the next step, actually add in the logic for the rest of our form and that submit form data function. So for part 4, we want to do something similar in step 1 that we did in the last step, which is hide this name and email field for users that are logged in. So if a user is logged in, there's no need to get this information. We already know it. And if they are, then we can show it. So what we're going to do is write in some logic that's going to change that. And then we're going to change up how we see that shipping information or the entire form. So if we don't need to ship the item or the user name does not need to be there, we can hide the entire form and automatically render out the payment button. So let's go ahead and take care of that. It looks like I didn't provide a screenshot in here, but I wrote out a couple of scenarios here, and I am just going to copy and paste the logic, and then I'll go over it just because I don't have that image. So I think I can just do this slowly and explain as I go. So this logic is going to be added just underneath this if statement. So under the shipping statement, we're going to paste in 2 more conditionals. So let's just go over these. I'll fix the indentation here, and I'll also zoom in to make sure everyone can see this. So what we're doing here is first we're checking if the user is not an anonymous user. So if the user is logged in, we're going to take this user info wrapper. So it's kind of like shipping info, and it's the one we created right here. And we're going to say that if the user is not an anonymous user, so if they're logged in, go ahead and hide that wrapper. Now, if the user shipping information is false, so if the user does not need an item shipped and the user is also logged in, go ahead and hide the entire form wrapper and open up the payment wrapper. So go ahead and remove the payment wrapper information. So the source code will be provided with all of this. So if you need to look this over, go ahead and do that. But the logic is pretty simple. We're just trying to create some different scenarios here. And now as a logged in user, the first thing that we should see is this user form be hidden. Now we're only seeing the shipping information. So we're logged in, we only see that. And if we remove an item here that needs to be shipped, so we only have a digital item, go to our checkout page. Now we're seeing this payment option appear immediately and that entire form is open. So I'll quickly show you what an unauthenticated user is going to look like. So we'll log out really quick. We'll go back to the checkout page. We don't have any products, so that's not going to show anything. But if we go to the cart, go to checkout here. Now that the user is not authenticated, we can see the user form. We don't have any products, so shipping is by default set to false. So that's what that takes care of. And we can move on to the next step. So in the next step, what we want to do is set the total value. So we actually want to get this data and send it to the backend along with some user information. So we actually want to get that name, email, total, shipping information, send it to the backend. And then eventually in part 5, we'll handle processing the order, and that will be the end of this video and module. So back to our checkout page, let's set just under shipping, let's get the total. So we're gonna set var total, and this is gonna be equal to the order total that we passed in through our view. And we're gonna set that to a string. And the value is gonna be order.get underscore cart underscore total. And we're going to set the float format, so float format, and we want 2 decimal places to the right. So we'll throw in 2 right there, and that needs to be format. So we have the total now, and what we want to do is within this submit form data function, we want to create 2 objects and then pass in some data with those. So we're going to set var user form data, and this is going to equal to an object here, and we're going to say name. This by default is going to be set to null. Then we want to throw in an email. This is also going to be set to null, and we'll update all these values once the form is actually submitted. So these will be updated in a second here. So both will be set to null, and we want to pass in the total with the user. So each time this is submitted, we always want to throw in that total there. And finally, we want to do the same for shipping address. So let's copy this right here and paste it below. And we just need to change these values to our shipping field. So for this, we're going to set this to address. And they're supposed to be an exact replica of our form field. So in our form field, we've manually created each field, so they all have a name. So we're just getting these values right here. So we have address, then we'll bring on city, state, and zip code. So we'll just copy and paste that and then repeat it. Let's get rid of total and change this to state and zip code. So let's also change the value of this to shipping info. And that's going to be a capital I. So we have shipping info, user form data, and once the form is submitted, we want to update these values. So there's probably a way we can do this where we can just set the values directly in here, but because I already wrote up my instructions this way and I just want to stick with that, we're going to follow along exactly how I set it up there. So right now, what I do in my instructions is create this conditional where we check the value of shipping and anonymous user and update the values depending on what they are. So we're first going to check if shipping is not false. So we'll write that conditional here and we're going to say shipping. And in JavaScript, we can do not equals to this way. And remember, false or that shipping value is a string value. So it's either false or true and in a string value. So if shipping is not equal to false, which is what we set up here, then we want to update the shipping info object. So we'll paste that in and we're going to say dot address, and we're going to set the value of address to the values within the form field. So we have the form right here. So that means we can access it this way. So we can say form dot address. And remember, we have all those form fields in there, so we need to get the field and then the value of the field. And I want to repeat this 3 more times here, so we'll set that up, and we're just going to change these values. So shipping city here, and state and zip code. So we'll set the zip code, and next we want to do the user form data. So we're going to copy this again right here and take in user form data. So for the if statement, first we want to check if this is an anonymous user. So if this user is registered, then we don't need to update this because we already have the information. So we're going to say if user, and remember user was set in main.html, so that's how we're able to access that object. So if the user is equal to anonymous user, and that's a capital U right there, so capital A, capital U, then let's go ahead and change these values for user form data. So we'll paste in these two, we'll remove the bottom two here, and we want to change the name and the email. So we'll set user.form data name, we'll set that to form.name.value, and set the email. So we're able to access these from the same variable because form here is all one big form that we set up with just 2 different sections for our field. So we're accessing the same form and setting the values. So for the last part in our modules here, in part 5, we're going to finish processing this order. So what we're going to do first is create a view and URL pattern that's going to process this. We're going to send some data to that view, and then in step 3 through 6, we're actually going to send that data and then actually create and process this order, set the value to complete, and take care of everything like that. So let's go ahead and handle that. We'll go to step 1, and in step 1, we're going to call that function process order here. It's just going to return the JSON response here and say payment was submitted and that URL pattern. So we're going to move checkout.html to the right here, and I'm going to close out the model, and we'll open up the views. We're going to create the view just underneath our updateItem view. So just under here, let's create the function, and we'll call it process order. We'll capitalize the O there, throw in request, and I'm actually just going to copy and paste this return value. So we'll set the JSON response, and for this, we'll just say payment complete. So we're going to send back the string, and now let's set the URL pattern. So we'll open up urls.py and repeat this process. I want to drag this to the right so we can see it, and we're going to take in or paste it in here and then pass in process order. So this will be process underscore order, and I'm going to change the value here. So let's make sure that the view works first. So open up our website and paste in process order, or just type it out, process underscore order. So there we go, we have our JSON response. We'll go back to our checkout page, and let's go ahead and finish up everything in checkout.html. So now what we need to do is send some post data. Looks like I messed something up in our checkout.html page, and I think that was when we set up this float format, and that was supposed to be a colon, so I hope you noticed that and fixed it, but it wasn't too far back there, so we shouldn't have an issue. So now that that's fixed, let's go back to our steps, and in our steps right here, in step 2, we need to send some post data. So we're going to set the URL, and we're going to send the post request, we're going to send in our CSRF token, and we're going to send in those objects for that user form data and shipping info, and then we're going to refresh the page and send the user to our store. So whenever the store is complete, we're going to redirect them. So we'll finish that up. Let's go ahead and take care of it. I'm going to close out our urls.py file, and we'll add in that fetch request inside of our submit form data function just underneath this if statement. So first we'll set the variable for the URL, and that's going to be the URL that we just set. So that's going to be process, so / process underscore order. So this is where we want to send this data to, and we can create that fetch call. So fetch, we'll pass in the URL, and then we want to set the method and the headers. So method will be a post, and for the headers, we're going to pass in the content type and the CSRF token. So that'll be another object right here. And we can do content dash type, and this will be application /JSON. So we have the content type, and now we need to do the CSRF token. So x dash CSRF capital T, and then finish out token. And then we can get the CSRF token again because it's in our headers of our main.html file. So CSRF token, and we can pass that in, and we need to throw an R there. And finally, we'll throw in the body. So for the body, let's set the stringify value first. So JSON.stringify. And into stringify, we need to pass in our shipping and user information. So let's set the value of form. And for form, we're going to pass in the general user information. So we'll take in this object here. That's going to give us a name, email, and the total price. And then for shipping, so we'll set that value. We're going to get the shipping info object. So we're going to stringify this data. We're going to send it to the backend. And then once that data gets sent, we want to create a response. So we want to return that promise and then return this payment complete string here. So we want to make sure that's done. And then once that's complete, we want to send the user back to our homepage. So what I'm going to do here is go to this code block, and we're first going to grab this response right here, and we'll paste that in just after our fetch call. So if you don't have that step-by-step guide, go ahead and just type that out. It's .then. We have an arrow function. We turn that JSON response there, and then we have another promise. So we're going to paste this in just after .then, and then we're going to take that data, we're going to console it out, and we're going to create an alert that's going to say the transaction was completed. Once that alert is closed, we're going to send the user back to the homepage, and let's quickly print out some data here just so we can see it. And we want to know that the data was sent to process order. So we're just going to say data, and we're going to print out request.body. And we want to send that data and be redirected. So let's test it. So back to our website, let's make sure we're logged in, and we'll go to checkout here. And right now, because we're logged in, we don't need the user information, and we also don't need any shipping data because there's no products that need it. So we'll minimize this a little bit here, and I'm going to click make payment. We're going to see that data sent. So transaction complete, the data was sent. And once that's done, we are redirected back to our homepage. Here is the data that was printed out. So that worked exactly like we wanted it to. So what we want to do now is, in the next step, is start working with that data. So we're first going to import datetime. Then we want to create a transaction ID. So there's many different ways we can create a transaction ID. I'm just going to use a timestamp. We're going to set that value, and we're going to continue from there. So let's first import datetime into our view, and then we'll set the transaction ID with datetime, and then we're going to set the timestamp. So I want to go back here. We'll just import datetime. And down in our view, this is where we can set it now. So I'll remove this print statement, and we're going to say transaction underscore ID, and that's going to be datetime dot datetime, and we're going to get the current value. So dot now, and then we're going to say dot timestamp. So this will give us that that long character field there. So dot timestamp, and that's also a function. So I want to make sure we got that right. Datetime dot datetime dot now dot timestamp. So we have the timestamp, and now we can move on to setting up our conditional for our authenticated users and guest users. So remember, now an authenticated user and a guest user can purchase an order. So we need to create that statement, and we're going to say if request.user.is underscore authenticated. And once they're authenticated, we want to get the customer, and we're going to get the customer by just getting request.user.customer. And then before we finish this off, let's just set the else condition. And for this, we're just going to print out user is not logged in. So user is not logged in. And back to our request, we need to get the order. So we're going to use the get or create method. So what I'm going to do is actually copy this value here, and we're going to take that from our update item view. And if we don't have the value, we want to make sure we create it. We set the customer, and we need to get the order that has the value of complete to false. So we got the order. We want to get our total now. And we also need to parse the data too. So I forgot to do that. Let's set the value of data, and that's going to be JSON.loads. And we're going to throw in request.body. So we want to parse that data, and then we want to access it. So now that we have data, we'll fix that. We can get data, and then we can get that total. So we're going to get the total by setting the variable of total to data, and then we're going to get the form. So remember how we passed in our data, we stringified it. So now that we parsed it, we sent the form, and that's going to be the user data. So we need to get the form value. And then once we have that, we can get the user object within it and the total. So we want to get this specific value right here. So we're going to say form, and then we're going to access total. So our variable of total is now whatever we passed in here. And I want to set that to a float field just in case. So sometimes it might send it as a string value just to ensure that it's correct. We'll set it to a float field. And then we can set our order transaction ID. So we're going to set order.transaction.id or transaction_ID. And then that's going to be the value that we just set here. So we set our order value for the transaction ID. And now what we want to do is check if the total passed in from the front end is the same as our cart total. So somebody brought this up as a comment in one of my videos, and I had the solution, but I figured I would show it to you guys here because our PayPal information will be processed on the front end, but then sent to the back end. So right now we want to make sure that a user does not manipulate the data from the front end, because in theory, if they know a little bit of JavaScript and they can figure out how we built our website, they can manipulate that and get a product for value that they want to set. So what we want to do is first check if the total that was passed in is the same as our cart total. If it's true, then we'll just go ahead and set complete to true, and we'll save that order. So let's take care of that. It's a pretty simple statement here, and that's going to be done right here. So we're going to say if total is equal to order.get_cart total here. We want to set order.complete, and that's going to be set to true now. So we'll set it to true, and regardless of whether the total is correct or not, we'll still save it. So if the value was incorrect, we'll still save it. Complete will remain false, but now we can save the order and confirm it, and then we can set up any other way we want to check if a user has manipulated that data, or just check that cart value and make sure everything's correct. So the last thing we want to do for an authenticated user, and this is the last step in the module, is to set the value of our shipping. So we want to create some logic. So after our cart total, we want to check if shipping is true. If it's true, let's go ahead and create the shipping address, and we'll set all of the values. So we sent it in from our post request, and we want to set that now. So we'll say if order.shipping, if that is equal to true, let's go ahead and create the shipping address object. So shipping address, this is the model now. So we can do shipping address.objects.create, and we can just create all the attributes. So first we're going to set the value of customer, and I'm going to pull up the models.py file, make sure we can see this. We need to set a customer, an order, address, city, state, zip code, and date added will be automatic. So in here, we'll just set customer to the value of the customer. Then we want to set order, and that is going to be the order that we just created. So we're just attaching everything. And for our address, we can just use that form data that we sent in. So for the address, we set the form data to this object, and then we passed it in. So we first need to access shipping and then access the fields in here. So we'll take in address, city, and state. So we can do that by grabbing this data that we parsed. And earlier we grabbed the form. So now we want to grab shipping because that is what we called that attribute. So we're going to take in shipping and we want to take in address. So let's go ahead and repeat this a couple more times for our other fields here. We'll add in the comma and we'll paste this in for city, state, and zip code, and we'll change these values. So we'll set city, we'll change the value there. We want to take in state, so we'll change that up right there, and zip code. So that should do it for the shipping address. So we want to test this by going to our page and checking out, and we want to add an item that has the shipping address so we can actually make sure it gets created. So if we go to our website here, let's refresh it, and I want to go to the admin panel and make sure that we don't have any complete orders or a shipping address. So right now we have an order here, and by default it got created because we need to set up an order with a status of false for now. So the status was set to false, or complete is set to false, and then we want to go to shipping addresses. So we have none right now, and we want to add an order or we want to add an item to our cart that needs to be shipped. We'll go to our checkout page. Now that we're prompted for it, we can go to continue, hit make payment. We should be able to be redirected to our checkout page. Let's see what's going on here. For some reason, it's not redirecting us. So in our console, it looks like we spelled from instead of form. So for the total, this needs to be form. And we should be able to give this one more test, and we should be able to place that order now. So give it a second here. Let's add in our shipping address, continue, and make payment. So we get sent back to the home page. If you look at our cart, we should see this reset to 0 eventually. But I guess that our order total, so it looks like we're not updating this cart total correctly. So we're not setting the value to complete. And that is probably because the order total is different from the cart total because of what we did in our checkout page. So right now, the numbers go beyond two decimal points to the right. So what we're gonna do is remove this because we're not displaying it anyway, so there was no need to format that. So I'm gonna get rid of that and we'll save it. And now when we compare our get cart total, they should be an exact match, and we shouldn't have an issue with the decimal places exceeding a certain amount. So let's save that, and I'll make sure to, for anybody following the steps, I'll make sure to update the steps so we're not showing that float format, and we'll fix things like that. So let's go ahead and try that one more time. We'll go to our cart, we'll check out, we'll add an address here, we'll go through make payment, and now our order is complete. If we go to our shipping addresses, this is the second time we added it, so it looks like it added it on the first round, and we also completed our order. So if we go to our first order, the status was set to complete, we set the transaction ID, and we automatically create a new order when we go back to that home page. The reason why we created a new order is because in our store view right here, we need to query an order to be able to show a cart. So if we don't have one, we just create it by default, and that's how we check out without the payment integration. In the next video, what we're gonna do is handle the unauthenticated user side of things. So we wanna be able to create our cart in the cookies and then allow a user to check out. So all these areas that we left blank here, so for these sections right here, we actually wanna start building that user's order and prepping us for checking out.